Hey everyone, I'm Pastor Barry Stagner of Calvary Chapel Tustin with today's prophecy and the news update. Make sure you give our new channel a like and subscribe so you can stay up to speed on all the events happening in the world as they pertain to biblical prophecy. Our first story today is a bit of a follow-up to what we covered last week in noting that there was a buildup of U.S., Jordanian, and British troops along the border of southern Syria that caused some anxiety, obviously, with both the Syrian government and their backers, the Russians. Well, today we have a story that is breaking in the Middle East once again concerning that same event, and that is that the Iranian-backed Hezbollah has now moved 12 groups or companies, if you will, numbering 1,000 soldiers to the border to combat the onset of this military alliance that has moved now into Syria. No longer are the troops of the U.S., the Jordanians, and the Brits gathering in Jordan, but rather they have now moved into southern Syria, which has drawn the ire of the Russian government as well as the actions of Hezbollah and again their Iranian backers. Interesting that the Russians have sided with Bashar al-Assad in seeking to stave off and protect their safe zones, the 4 safe zones that they have designated in the country of Syria in order to protect their interests there and bolster the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Now this is important prophetically for a number of reasons. One of them is that the Ezekiel war that is prophesied that is going to involve the Russians, the Iranians, nations from North Africa, as well as nations of the southern steppes of Russia, or we might call them the Stan nations. They are going to invade the nation of Israel, and they're going to do so having been drawn down out of the far north. Now, we don't know exactly what the mechanism is going to be to draw them down. We do know that there are some monetary interests involved, as there are protesting nations in Ezekiel 38 and 39, specifically Sheba and Dedan, which is representative of the Gulf states, or Saudi Arabia and Dubai in that particular region of the world, the UAE. And interestingly, they're going to protest saying, what's the cause of this invasion? What's your purpose of coming into the area? Have you come to take booty and plunder? Obviously terms associated with some type of energy-related product, most likely this being the Middle East. But they're going to be drawn down, and Ezekiel says that God is going to put a hook in their jaw and draw them down, turn them around, and draw them down out of the far north. Now, it's been well cited that if you draw a line from Jerusalem to the North Pole, it goes directly through Moscow. So obviously the Russians are going to be involved. And could this be some type of precursor to increasing the strain in the Middle East, with now the American presence stepping up its tactics in Syria and dealing with Bashar al-Assad, who sadly we have kind of vacillated on our position for and then against. We've supported the rebels and we've not supported the rebels. And now it seems like we are taking a solid position with this new administration, which again is causing Russian troops and American, British, and Jordanian troops to at least begin posturing for potential clashes in the future. So clearly, an American, Jordanian, and British presence inside the borders of southern Syria in Kenitra and Homs and Daraa has now caused the Russians to become more aggressive in their position, both militarily and diplomatically in the region. So could this be a part of the hook in the jaw? It's certainly possible that it could be. One of the other things that we need to cover today is the fact that Zechariah tells us that in the last days, Jerusalem is going to become a burdensome stone to all nations. And it's been no secret that UNESCO, or a division, the educational and scientific division of the United Nations, has been very proactive in basically disparaging Israel, their right to Jerusalem, condemning them, stating that they're occupying territories that were actually given to them by God, and they have a 3,000-year history of a presence in the land, including the city of Jerusalem, both sides of the capital city of Israel. And the fact is, we live in an age where history is largely being ignored, because the truth is, in 1947, there was an international agreement that partitioned off land to those living in the region known as Israel today. And the international community stated that this was going to be the home of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. Well, having made this partition agreement, there was an immediate invasion on May 15th, according to our calendar, 1948, of 5 nations who sought the absolute destruction of the Zionists and the driving of the Israelis into the sea. Now, the international community, rather interestingly, has sided with Israel, and they have been consistent of late in their turning on that initial policy. On November 29, 1947, Resolution 181, Part 2, the partition plan of the mandatory Palestine at the end of the British Mandate, and recommended the separation into 3 parts: an Arab state, a Jewish state, and the city of Jerusalem, or the Jerusalem Corpus Separatum. Now, according to the plan, Jews and Arabs living in the Jewish state would become Jewish citizens, and the Arabs living in the Arab state would become citizens of the Arab state. Now, this was accepted by all parties involved. And as I said, the next day after this agreement was finalized and Israel stated its position as a new entity in the Middle East, a nation, they were invaded by 5 nations. And once again, in 1967, there was another series of invasions against Israel, the famous Six-Day War of 67, where East Jerusalem was captured. Now, this is critical to our understanding, because Daniel the prophet tells us that there's going to be a man who stands in the most holy place. We often refer to him as the Antichrist. Revelation calls him the first beast, and that's a more fitting title for him. But he's going to stand in the rebuilt temple in the most holy place and declare himself to be God. Now, this requires, or even assumes, that there's going to be a 3rd temple that is built for him, in order to, first of all, cut off the daily sacrifices. The daily sacrifices that Daniel speaks of have to first be implemented, and they can only take place within the city of Jerusalem, and specifically on the Temple Mount in some cases. So this demands that there be a 3rd temple, one, for the sacrifices to be first reinstituted and then rescinded by the Antichrist, and for him to go in to the Holy of Holies, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant has long stood, and declare himself to the world to be God. So Jerusalem is becoming a focal point of world entities once again. Even though initially the support, beginning all the way back in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, gave the land and set it aside for the Jews as their own homeland, the historic homeland of the Jews, for 2 millennia before the diaspora, and where they were driven out to all the other nations in 132 AD by Hadrian, the Roman emperor. So this tells us, again, things are moving forward and advancing in the realm of prophetic history. I like the description of prophecy being history in advance, because God knows the beginning from the end, and he is simply stating these are the things that are going to take place as he sits on his position on high and sees both the beginning and the end simultaneously, the beginning and the end of human history, that is. And the focal point in the last days is going to be Jerusalem. And we continue to see, even on the 69th anniversary of the rebirth of the nation of Israel, and now approaching the 50th anniversary of the capture of Jerusalem, the eastern side of Jerusalem, which includes the Temple Mount, which, by the way, is still under Jordanian rule. But the truth is, Jerusalem is becoming a burdensome stone to the whole world, and the whole world is talking about the city. Well, one more thing that's an area of interest for me. I know many of you like to follow things that I follow as well, some of the events surrounding the last days that are outside of the study of the nation of Israel, their role in the last days, and God dealing with them specifically as he has in the past during the 70th week of Daniel, prophesied in Daniel chapter 9, that there are 70 weeks intended for Daniel, his people, and his city. So there's a yet unfulfilled 7-year period we call the Great Tribulation, broken down into 2 halves. The first half, a season of pseudo-peace, followed followed by the second half, the great and terrible day of the Lord, where God judges the world. But we know that as he judges the world, there's going to be cataclysmic events that were prophesied by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. Now, the Olivet Discourse is presented as a progression, that things are going to increase with frequency and intensity, as Jesus used the phrase birth pangs to describe an increase in world events, including wars and rumors of wars, the rise of false Christ, pestilence, meaning rampant disease around the world. But he also used an interesting term there when he is talking about the ethnic tensions and the upheaval internationally between parties. He also closes with a reference to seismos, and obviously seismology comes to mind. It's where we get our English word, but the Greek term seismos actually means a tempest, and it isn't restricted to geological events. It can include other events. Certainly it can also be translated as a gale, so it can talk about or potentially be describing cosmic events as well, meteor showers and things like that we see in Revelation. Revelation clearly teaches that there's going to be an asteroid strike and a comet strike on the earth during the great and terrible day of the Lord. But we also have in the prophecies of Joel that there's going to be an event that takes place on the earth that spews ash into the air, that darkens the sun and makes the moon turn into blood. Now, these aren't eclipses, as many like to say today. They are simply a cataclysmic event on the earth, a geological event that takes place that sends a dust cloud into the air that temporarily blocks the sun's impact on the earth. And obviously it can't be for any length of time, because we would get into what has been described like a nuclear winter, where crops can't grow and people are going to freeze to death. So it is a geological event most likely that takes place. And this leads to our final story and reminder of today. It's kind of interesting that there is a supervolcano, and there are 18 of them on the planet. And in the last 100 years, all 18 of them have become active once again, including one in Italy. And it's called Campi Flegrei. And it's just 9 miles west of Naples. And the last time it erupted in 1538, it was active for 100 years prior to that, beginning spewing ash and releasing helium-4 gas, like often happens even in Yellowstone in our own country, as well as we're seeing interesting movements here in California in the caldera. And in Mammoth, there's a huge 20-mile wide mouth of a volcano right here in California that is also showing activity. But this particular activity, this supervolcano, has an explosivity index of 7, which is second highest on the scale, which basically, if there were a full-blown eruption, would flatten everything in every direction for 500 miles. Now, this is nothing like what we have seen even with Mount St. Helens as it exploded here in our country some 2 decades ago. But what it is something on a much larger scale that basically just levels everything in every direction. And this is a volcano that has erupted before in history, and it has had a great impact, even as the Icelandic volcano erupted last year, on jet streams and obviously air traffic in our day. Obviously that didn't happen in 1538, but it did impact weather patterns. And now we're having rumblings of this supervolcano in Italy, 9 miles from Naples, which tells us that the earth too is groaning and travailing, as Romans chapter 8 tells us, seeking also its own deliverance, for the whole of creation has fallen. And we know that the world, according to Isaiah, is going to reel to and fro like a drunken man during the tribulation period. And this tells us of cosmic and geological events. So again, we've got an active supervolcano that scientists now are saying is probably going to erupt sooner rather than later, and it's been active now for some 67 years, and its previous history says in that time frame, all the things that they're seeing today are indications that this supervolcano is potentially going to erupt in the very near future. So once again, we've got the Russians, the Persians, all those nations prophesied becoming militarily active in coalition with one another, many of them now boots on the ground and on the northern border of Israel, in the city, outside the city of Kenitra, which you can see from the Golan in Israel. You can see the buildings of the city when you stand at the Valley of Tears in the Golan in Israel and look down into southern Syria. We've also got, again, the United Nations standing against the nation of Israel, rebuking them, calling their areas in Jerusalem occupied territories, as well as the West Bank. And now we've got cosmic activity or geological activity happening in our world that tells us that there is coming a day where the Lord is going to release his wrath on this world. And there are precursors in birth pang-like succession that Jesus said would be happening when it's time to look up. So once again, give us a subscribe and a like. God bless you guys. Hope you have a blessed week.